CinemaScope is an anamorphic lens series used from 1953 to 1967 for shooting widescreen movies. Its creation in 1953 by Spyros P.Skouras, the president of 20th Century Fox, marked the beginning of the modern anamorphic format in both principal photography and movie projection. The anamorphic lenses theoretically allowed the process to create an image of up to a 2.661 aspect ratio, almost twice as wide as the previously common Academy format's 1.371 ratio. Although the CinemaScope lens system was made obsolete by new technological developments primarily advanced by Panavision, the CinemaScope anamorphic format has continued to this day. In film industry jargon, the shortened form scope is still widely used by both filmmakers and projectionists, although today it generally refers to any 2.351, 2.391, or 2.401 presentation, or, sometimes, the use of anamorphic lensing a projection in particular. Bausch & Amp-Telome won a 1954 Oscar for its development of the CinemaScope lens. Origins: a French inventor named Professor Henri Crétion developed and patented a new film process that he called anamorphoscope in 1926. It was this process that would later form the basis for CinemaScope. Crétion's process was based on lenses that employed an optical trick which produced an image twice as wide as those that were being produced with conventional lenses. This was done using an optical system called hypergona, which was the process of compressing and dilating the image laterally. He attempted to interest the motion picture industry in his invention, but at the time the industry was not sufficiently impressed. By 1950, however, cinema attendance seriously declined with the advent of a new competitive rival, television. Yet Cinerama and the early 3D films, both launched in 1952, succeeded at the box office in defying this trend, which in turn persuaded Spyros P.Skouras, the head of 20th Century Fox, that technical innovation could help to meet the challenge. Skouras tasked Earl Sponable, head of Fox's research department, with devising a new, impressive projection system, but something that, unlike Cinerama, could be retrofitted to existing theaters at a relatively modest cost. And then Herbert Bragg, Sponable's assistant, remembered Crétion's hypergona lens. The optical company Bausch & Amp-Telome was asked to produce a prototype anamorphoser lens. Meanwhile, Sponable tracked down Professor Crétion, whose patent for the process had expired. So Fox purchased his existing hypergonas from him, and these lenses were flown back to Fox's studios in Hollywood. Test footage shot with these lenses was screened for Skouras, who gave the go-ahead for development of a widescreen process based on Crétion's invention, which was to be known as CinemaScope. 20th Century Fox's pre-production of The Robe, originally committed to Technicolor 3-strip origination, was halted so that the film could be changed to a CinemaScope production. Two other CinemaScope productions were also planned: How to Marry a Millionaire and Beneath the 12-Mile Reef, so that production of these first CinemaScope films could proceed without delay. Shooting started using the best three of Crétion's hypergonas, while Bausch & Amp-Telome continued working on their own versions. The introduction of CinemaScope enabled Fox and other studios to reassert its distinction from the new competitor, television. Crétion's hypergonas proved to have significant optical and operational defects. Bausch & Amp-Telome, Fox's prime contractor for the production of these lenses, initially produced an improved Crétion formula adapter lens design, and subsequently produced a dramatically improved and patented Bausch & Amp-Telome formula adapter lens design. Ultimately, Bausch & Amp-Telome formula combined lens These designs incorporated both the prime lens and the anamorphic lens in one unit. These combined lenses continue to be used to this day, particularly in special effects units. Other manufacturers' lenses are often preferred for so-called production applications that benefit from significantly lighter weight or lower distortion, or a combination of both characteristics. Early implementation, CinemaScope was developed to use a separate film for sound, thus enabling the full silent 1.331 aperture to be available for the picture, with a 2:1 anamorphic squeeze applied that would allow an aspect ratio of 2.661. When, however, developers found that magnetic stripes could be added to the film to produce a composite picture sound print, the ratio of the image was reduced to 2.551. This reduction was kept to a minimum by reducing the width of the normal case perforations so that they were nearly square, but of DH height. This was the CinemaScope, or CS, perforation, known colloquially as foxholes. Later still an optical sound track was added, reducing the aspect ratio further to 2.351. This change also meant a shift in the optical center of the projected image. All of Fox's CinemaScope films were made using a silent, full aperture for the negatives, as was the studio's practice for all films, whether anamorphic or not. In order to better hide so-called negative assembly splices, the ratio of the image was later changed by others to 2.391 and, finally, to 2.401. All professional cameras are capable of shooting 2.551 or 2.661, and 2.351 or 2.391 or 2.401 is simply a hard-matted version of the others. Fox selected The Robe as the first film to start production in CinemaScope, a project chosen because of its epic nature. During its production, How to Marry a Millionaire and Beneath the 12-Mile Reef also went into CinemaScope production. Millionaire finished production first before The Robe, but because of its importance, The Robe was released first. Fox used its influential people to promote CinemaScope. With the success of The Robe and How to Marry a Millionaire, the process enjoyed success in Hollywood. Fox licensed the process to many of the major film studios including Columbia, Warner Brothers, Universal, MGM and Walt Disney Productions. Walt Disney Productions was one of the first companies to license the CinemaScope process from Fox. Among the features and shorts they filmed with it, they created the live-action epic 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, considered one of the best examples of early CinemaScope productions. Walt Disney Productions' Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom, which won an Academy Award 1953, was the first cartoon produced in CinemaScope. The first animated feature film to use CinemaScope was Lady and the Tramp, also from Walt Disney Productions. Due to initial uncertainty about whether the process would be adopted widely, a number of films were shot simultaneously with anamorphic and regular lenses. Despite early success with the process, Fox did not shoot every production by this process. They reserved CinemaScope as a trade name for their A productions, while B productions in black and white were begun in 1956 at Fox under the trade name RegalScope. The latter used the very same optics as CinemaScope, but usually a different camera system. Audio. Fox officials were keen that the sound of the new widescreen film format should be as impressive as the picture, and that meant it should include true stereophonic sound. Previously, stereo sound in the commercial cinema had always employed separate sound films. Walt Disney's 1940 release Fantasia had used a 3-channel soundtrack played from separate optical film. Early post-war stereo systems used with Cinerama and some 3D films had used multi-channel audio played from a separate magnetic film. Fox had initially intended to use 3-channel stereo from magnetic film for CinemaScope. However, Hazard E. Reeves Sound Company had devised a method of coating 35mm stock with magnetic stripes and designed a 3-channel system based on 3/063 wide stripes, one on each edge of the film outside the perforations, and one between the picture and the perforations in approximately the position of a standard optical soundtrack. Later it was found possible to add a narrower 029 stripe between the picture and perforations on the other side of the film. This fourth track was used for a surround channel, also sometimes known at the time as an effects channel. In order to avoid hiss on the surround effects channel from distracting the audience, the surround speakers were switched on by a 12 kHz tone, recorded on the surround track only while wanted surround program material was present. This 4-track magnetic sound system was also used for some non-CinemaScope films. For example, Fantasia was re-released in 1956, 1963, and 1969 with the original Fanta soundtrack transferred to 4-track magnetic. Rival processes. CinemaScope itself was a response to early realism process Cinerama and 3D. Cinerama was relatively unaffected by CinemaScope, as it was a quality-controlled process that played in select venues, similar to the IMAX films of recent years. 3D was hurt, however, by studio advertising surrounding CinemaScope's promise that it was the miracle you see without glasses. Technical difficulties in presentation spelled the true end for 3D, but studio hype was quick to hail it a victory for CinemaScope. In April 1953, a technique simply now known as widescreen appeared and was soon adopted as a standard by all flat film productions in the US. In this process, a fully exposed 1.37:1 Academy ratio area is cropped in the projector to a widescreen aspect ratio by the use of an aperture plate, also known as a soft matte. Most films shot today use this technique, cropping the top and bottom of a 1.37:1 image to produce one at a ratio of 1.851. Aware of Fox's upcoming CinemaScope productions, Paramount introduced this technique in March's release of Shane with the 1.661 aspect ratio, although the film was not shot with this ratio originally in mind. Universal International followed suit in May with a 1.851 aspect ratio for Thunder Bay. By summer of 1953, Paramount, Universal, MGM, Columbia, and even Fox's B-Unit contractors, under the banner of Panoramic Productions, had switched from filming flat shows in a 1.37:1 format, and used variable flat widescreen aspect ratios in the filming, which would become the standard of that time. By this time, Creation's 1926 patent on the hypergoner lens had expired, while the fundamental technique that CinemaScope utilized was not patentable, because the anamorphoscope had been known for centuries. Anamorphosis had been used in visual media such as Hans Holbein's painting, The Ambassadors. Some studios thus sought to develop their own system rather than pay Fox. In response to the demands for a higher visual resolution spherical widescreen process, Paramount created an optical process, VistaVision, which shot horizontally on the 35mm film roll, and then printed down to standard 4x vertical 35mm. Thus, a negative with a finer grain was created and release prints had less grain. The first Paramount film in VistaVision was White Christmas. VistaVision died out in the late 1950s with the introduction of faster film stocks. RKO used the CinemaScope process, in which the standard 35mm image was cropped and then optically squeezed in post-production to create an anamorphic image on film. Today's Super 35 is a variation of this process. Another process called CinemaScope was developed by Technicolor Inc. in the early 1960s, using normal 35mm cameras modified for 2 perforations per frame instead of the regular 4 and later converted into an anamorphic print. CinemaScope was mostly used in Europe, especially with low-budget films. Many European countries and studios used the standard anamorphic process for the widescreen films, identical in technical specifications to CinemaScope, and renamed to avoid the trademarks of Fox. Some of these include Euroscope, Franscope, and Naturama. In 1953, Warner Brothers also planned to develop an identical anamorphic process called WarnerScope, but after the premiere of CinemaScope, Warner's decided to license it from Fox instead. Technical difficulties. Although CinemaScope was capable of producing a 2.661 image, the addition of magnetic sound tracks for multi-channel sound reduced this to 2.551. The fact that the image was expanded horizontally when projected meant that there could be visible graininess and brightness problems. To combat this, larger film formats were developed and then abandoned. Later Fox re-released The King and I in the 65/70th format. The initial problems with grain and brightness were eventually reduced thanks to improvements in film stock and lenses. The CinemaScope lenses were optically flawed, however, by the fixed anamorphic element, which caused the anamorphic effect to gradually drop off as objects approached closer to the lens. The effect was that close-ups would slightly overstretch an actor's face, a problem that was soon referred to as the mumps. This problem was avoided at first by composing wider shots, but as anamorphic technology lost its novelty, directors and cinematographers sought compositional freedom from these limitations. Issues with the lenses also made it difficult to photograph animation using the CinemaScope process. Nevertheless, many animated short films and a few features were filmed in CinemaScope during the 1950s, including Walt Disney's Lady and the Tramp. Decline. Lens manufacturer Panavision was initially founded in late 1953 as a manufacturer of anamorphic lens adapters for movie projectors screening CinemaScope films. Capitalizing on the success of the new anamorphic format and filling in the gap created by Bausch & Lomb's inability to mass-produce the needed adapters for movie theaters fast enough, looking to expand beyond projector lenses, Panavision founder Robert Gottschalk soon improved upon the anamorphic camera lenses by creating a new lens set that included dual rotating anamorphic elements which were interlocked with the lens focus gearing. This innovation allowed the Panavision lenses to keep the plane of focus at a constant anamorphic ratio of 2x, thus avoiding the overstretched mumps effect found in CinemaScope. After screening a demo reel comparing the two systems, many U.S. studios adopted the Panavision anamorphic lenses. The Panavision technique was also considered more attractive to the industry because it was more affordable than CinemaScope and was not owned or licensed out by a rival studio. Confusingly, some studios, particularly MGM, continued to use the CinemaScope credit even though they had switched to Panavision lenses. Virtually all MGM CinemaScope films after 1958 are actually in Panavision. By 1967, even Fox had begun to abandon CinemaScope for Panavision. Although a significant amount of the principal photography was actually filmed using CinemaScope lenses, Fox eventually capitulated completely to third-party lenses. In Like Flint with James Coburn and Caprice with Doris Day were Fox's final films in CinemaScope. Fox originally intended CinemaScope films to use magnetic stereo sound only, and although in certain areas, such as Los Angeles and New York City, the vast majority of theaters were equipped for 4-track magnetic sound, the owners of many smaller theaters were dissatisfied with contractually having to install expensive 3- or 4-track magnetic stereo, and because of the technical nature of sound installations, drive-in theaters had trouble presenting stereophonic sound at all. Due to these conflicts, and because other studios were starting to release anamorphic prints with standard optical soundtracks, Fox revoked the policy of stereo-only presentations in 1957, and added a half-width optical soundtrack, while keeping the magnetic tracks for those theaters that were able to present the films with stereophonic sound. These so-called mag-optical prints provided a somewhat substandard optical sound and were also expensive to produce. It made little economic sense to supply those theaters which had only mono sound systems with an expensive striped print. Eventually Fox and others elected to supply the majority of the prints in standard mono-optical sound form, with magnetic striped prints reserved for those theaters capable of playing them. Magnetic striped prints were expensive to produce. Each print cost at least twice as much as a print with a standard optical soundtrack only. Furthermore, these striped prints wore out faster than optical prints and caused more problems in use, such as flakes of oxide clogging the replayer heads. Due to these problems, and also because many cinemas never installed the necessary playback equipment, magnetic sound prints started to be made in small quantities for roadshow screenings only, with the main release using standard mono-optical sound prints. As time went by, roadshow screenings were increasingly made using 70mm film, and the use of striped 35mm prints declined further. Many CinemaScope films from the 1960s and 1970s were never released in stereo at all. Finally, the introduction in 1976 of Dolby Stereo, which provided a similar performance to striped magnetic prints but more reliably and at a far lower cost, caused the 4-track magnetic system to become totally obsolete.